Between 1817 and 1867, the nation's coastal defense system included some 30 forts along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts. Fort Point was the only fort of this era built on the west coast. An 1857 newspaper article praised the fort's solid masonry of more than ordinary artistic skill. Join us as we discover Fort Point, the guardian of the gate. As you tour the fort, remember that in addition to serving as a heavily armed fortification, it was home to hundreds of men. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers began work on Fort Point in 1853. Workers blasted the 90-foot cliff down to 15 feet above sea level. The structure featured 7-foot thick walls and multi-tiered casemated construction typical of Civil War-era forts. It was sited to defend the maximum amount of harbor area. This is the third lighthouse built at this site, a natural promontory from which to guide mariners through waters that can be treacherous in fog. The first was demolished shortly after construction in 1852 to make way for Fort Point. The second, north of the fort at the tip of the point, suffered from constant erosion. The present lighthouse was used from 1864 until 1934, when the foundation for the Golden Gate Bridge blocked its light. In 1854, Inspector General Joseph F.K. Mansfield declared this point as the key to the whole Pacific coast, and it should receive untiring exertions. A crew of 200, many unemployed miners, labored for 8 years on the fort. In 1861, with war looming, the Army mounted the fort's first cannon. Throughout the Civil War, artillerymen at Fort Point stood guard for an enemy that never came. As of August 1865, upon the end of the Civil War, troops soon moved out of Fort Point, and it was never again continuously occupied by the Army. The fort was nonetheless important enough to receive protection from the elements. In 1869, a granite seawall was completed. The following year, some of the fort's cannons were moved to Battery East on the bluffs nearby, where they were more protected. In 1882, Fort Point was officially named Fort Winfield Scott after the famous Mexican War hero. The name never caught on here and was later applied to an artillery post at the Presidio. In 1892, the Army began constructing the new Endicott system concrete fortifications armed with steel, breech-loaded rifled guns. Within 8 years, all 102 of the smoothbore cannons at Fort Point had been dismounted and sold for scrap. The fort, moderately damaged in the 1906 earthquake, was used over the next 4 decades for barracks, training, and storage. Soldiers from the 6th U.S. Artillery were stationed here during World War II to guard minefields and the anti-submarine net that spanned the Golden Gate. In 1926, the American Institute of Architects proposed preserving the fort for its outstanding military architecture. Funds were unavailable and the idea languished. Plans for the Golden Gate Bridge in the 1930s called for the fort's removal, but Chief Engineer Joseph Strauss redesigned the bridge to save the fort. While the old fort has no military value now, Strauss said, it remains nevertheless a fine example of the mason's art. It should be preserved and restored as a national monument. Preservation efforts were revived after World War II. On October 16, 1970, President Richard Nixon signed the bill creating Fort Point National Historic Site. The fort tells a story of its years spent guarding the Golden Gate. Fort Point National Historic Site stands beneath the southern end of the Golden Gate Bridge. Hours are 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. The park is closed on Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's Day. The fort is wheelchair accessible on the ground floor, including the theater. Visitor activities include a brief introductory film, cannon loading demonstrations, guided and self-guiding tours, and an audio tour. Fort Point National Historic Site is part of the National Park System, one of more than 370 areas that are important examples of our nation's natural and cultural heritage. Thank you for visiting Fort Point in San Francisco, California.